January 1935. Kansas City. The hotel president is all chrome and whispers. It's a city of its own, stacked into 10 floors of strangers and secrets. A bellhop, Randolph Probst, is making his rounds when he stops outside room 1046. There's a cardboard tag hung from the knob that says "Do not disturb," but the switchboard downstairs is giving the phone off the hook alert for the third time this morning. So Randolph knocks. He doesn't have to wait long before a muffled voice from inside says, "Come in, turn on the lights." Randolph turns the knob and pushes the door, but it's locked from the inside. He leans in close to the door and politely responds that he can't come in because the door's locked, but that all he really needed was for the man to please hang up the phone. And he doesn't get an answer, and so he's not willing to disturb the guest any further. He just turns and continues on his way. Hours later, another bellhop comes back, and this time he uses the master key to get into the room. And as he walks into the room, it's dark, the blinds are pinned shut, and in the glow from the hallway, he makes out a shape. A young man, naked, kneeling on the carpet, arms propped on his elbows like he's trying to stand, thinking whoever this is needs help. But as he turns the light on, what he sees sends a chill down his spine. There's blood everywhere. It's on the sheets, the walls, even the ceiling. The man lifts his head. His wrists and neck bear deep ligature marks. His chest is punctured with stab wounds. His skull is fractured, yet he's still breathing. When the doctor arrives, he asks, "Who did this to you?" And in a weak voice, the bloodied man says, "Nobody," before collapsing to the ground. Welcome back to Legends May Live. This is the story of the man in room 1046 and of the strangers who kept his secrets. In January of 1935, Kansas City is neon and smoke. The week's front pages run from Lindbergh trial headlines to local mob fallout. Even the Kansas City massacre conspirators are facing sentences downtown. The hotel president stands 4 blocks from the library, a polished box of brass bellcaps and whispered favors. A young man with no bags, wearing dark overcoat, steps through the revolving door at about 1:20 p.m. He asks calmly for an interior room several floors up and signs his name as Ronald T. Owen from Los Angeles. The bellboy, Randolph Probst, leads him along the maze-like 10th floor. They take rights and lefts through the hallways into the inner row of rooms that face into the hotel's inner court rather than the street. They stop in front of room 1046, where Probst opens the door to let Roland inside. The inside of his room was pretty small. It was about 9 by 12 feet, or just under 3 by 4 meters. And the bed was to the right as you walk through the door. The phone stand is to the left, along with a writing table mid-wall and a dresser cocked in the corner. The guest unpacks a comb, brush, and toothpaste from his coat. That's all he had brought with him. And then Probst hands over the key, and soon Roland heads back out into the city, still annoyed at the outrageous $5 fee for an inside room, which $5 in 1935 would actually amount to about the equivalent of just under $120 today. One of the housekeepers, Mary Soptic, comes back from a day off and unlocks 1046 to clean. And surprised, she thought a woman had been there before her day off, but Roland is sitting quietly in the dark with shades drawn tight and one dim desk light on. He had a concerned expression on his face, sort of like he was worried or afraid, but Mary didn't press him. She just did her job and left. And on her way out, Roland asked her to leave the door unlocked because he said he was expecting a friend to stop in a few minutes. Then he put on his overcoat and slipped out. Later, around 4 p.m., Mary comes back with towels, and she checks the door, and it's still unlocked, so she knocks and let herself in. And the room's still dark, and Roland is just lying there on the bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. As Mary dropped off the towels, she could see from the light in the hallway, shining on the desk, that there was a letter or a note written there. It said, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." She didn't really think a lot of it and just wrapped up what she was doing and left. The next morning about 10:30, Mary brings her passkey. 1046 is locked from the outside, so she figures Roland is out. She unlocks the door and walks in to clean. But to her surprise, he's sitting in the dark, exactly where he was yesterday. And before she can say anything, the telephone rings and Roland answers. Mary can't hear the other side of the conversation, but she hears Roland say, "No, Don, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. No, I'm not hungry." And then after hanging up the phone, he starts chatting with Mary. He asks if she handles the whole floor, if the president is a residential, and complains again about the room price. She finishes up cleaning, gathers her dirty towels, and leaves. Then later that day, about 4 p.m., fresh towels in her arm, Mary's making her rounds again and hears two men talking inside of 1046. She knocks in a rough, deep voice, not the one she knows, asks who it is, and she responds, "Housekeeping, fresh towels?" And a deep voice snaps back, "We don't need any." She hesitates, knowing she took every towel that morning, and so there's no towels left in that room, but she decides to let it go, and she turns the cart and continues on her way, never returning to that room for the rest of her shift. And as the night progresses, the 10th floor of the hotel kind of thins out. The inner rooms, one by one, go dim, and the guests lay down for the night. But a guest in the room next to 1046 tosses and turns trying to sleep, but to her, for some reason, it feels like the walls are closing in. So she's lying awake, listening to the hum and murmur of pipes, creaks, and then the eventual voices. From 1046, she starts to hear a man's voice, low and controlled. And then another softer voice, coming in and out. Other people on the floor hear it too, and some say it sounded like a man and a woman, but others say it was two men. Either way, the conversation seems very tense, maybe like instructions or even a warning, but not really an argument. Then all of a sudden they hear a chair move and something light knocks over and then rights itself. And the woman in the room next door is telling herself not to interfere. She's thinking, this is a hotel after all. I don't know these people. It's really not my place to walk into other people's problems. So she restrained herself and just tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. Down by the elevators, the graveyard shift operator will later recall a woman stepping in out of the cold, coat clenched, hat brim low, asking for a room that doesn't quite exist on 10. Specifically, she's asking for room 1026. She rides up the elevator, wanders around for a bit, and then rides down again, reappearing with a man in a dark suit. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's a different story colliding with this one. For just a few seconds in the door's chrome reflection. But back on the inner row, the voices in 1046 go quiet. The neighbors finally drift off to sleep, and this is probably the last easy minute anyone on this floor will have. At 7 a.m., downstairs, the switchboard lamp for room 1046 turns red, indicating that the phone's off the hook. And the operator jigs the plug, listens, nothing but room tone, a breath of static, like someone set the receiver down and walked away. So the bellboy, Randolph Probst, heads up to the 10th floor and knocks on the door. At first it's quiet, so he knocks again, and he finally hears a voice telling him to come in. The voice sounds off, though, like something's wrong, and it sounds like it's coming from the floor. Probst tries the knob, but the door's locked, so he says in a polite but firm voice, "Sir, I can't. The door's latched. Would you please hang up your phone?" He listens, waiting for the click of a receiver returning to its cradle, but he doesn't hear anything, so he just turns and heads back downstairs, saying that he'll try again in a bit. Hotels kind of run on the idea that everything's fine until it isn't. Then at 8:30 a.m., the red light comes on again. They send Harold Pike, another bellboy, and this time he takes a passkey. Pike makes his way to the 10th floor, knocks on the door to room 1046, and then goes inside. When he steps in, the shades are pulled and there's no lights on. He looks over and a man is lying on top of the covers, totally naked, turned slightly on his side like he fell asleep mid-thought. And Pike sees the phone on the carpet, falling from the stand, so he leans in, finds the receiver, sets it back in its cradle with a tiny click. The man doesn't move. His breathing is shallow, but it's there. Pike closes the door and heads for the elevator, telling himself he's just woken someone from a rough night. 10:45 a.m., the operator's lamp for 1046 is back on again. that's not a hangover, that's a pattern. This time, the assistant manager walks up with Pike. And when they get to the room, they knock on the door once again. And this time, a man in kind of a muffled voice says, "Come in, turn on the lights." And the door gives an inch, but no more. The chain is fixed from the inside. At this, the assistant manager is agitated and firmly says, "Sir, hang up your phone." And Pike and the assistant manager just look at each other, trying to figure out what is going on. And they're thinking, is he drunk? Is he sick? Is he possibly violent? Do you call the police over a phone left off the hook? Or do you just keep the machinery running smooth and move to the next crisis? So they decided at this point to just go back downstairs and file a note to check back soon. And for a few more minutes, the building returns to normal. But a little bit later, the phone for 1046 is off the hook again. The assistant manager comes up with Pike again. They knock, then unlatch the door and start to step inside, but right away the light from the hall illuminates just enough for them to make out the shape of a man on the ground. And they can tell he's on his knees, hunched forward with his hands on the floor, kind of like he was trying to crawl for help and didn't make it. His skin is pale and sort of gray. His chest rattles as he gasps for air. There's blood on the sheets, on the ceiling, down the wall, and even in the bathroom. And immediately, the assistant manager turns to the bellboy and says, "Get downstairs, call the doctor now." And a physician from the general hospital arrives with the manager and Pike. They squeeze in the room and find the man in the bathtub, and they can see cords cutting into the man's wrists and ankles, along with one around his throat. They look raw and bruised, like someone tightened it and kept turning. His skull's fractured, and there's stab wounds high in the chest above the heart. One's pierced a lung. He's shock pale and slick with blood, but conscious enough to track faces and apparently to have made it into the tub. And the doctor cuts the cords and asks, "Who did this to you?" To which the man weakly replied, "Nobody." At this point, the doctor is just trying to keep him awake and alive, but if he gets helpful information too, that's great. So he asks the man, "What happened?" And through labored breaths, he just said, "Fell against the bathtub." Then he slumps. The doctor signals the stretcher. They hustle to the elevator, heads down, shoes making a red trail through the hallway. And the hospital rushes him down to surgery as soon as he arrives, but a little after midnight, technically in the early mornings of Saturday, January 5th, 1935, he dies from his injuries. He had skull fractures from repeated blows, deep ligature and bruising at the throat and around his wrists and ankles, stab wounds high in the chest, one piercing the lung. The man from 1046 is now a John Doe with a cauliflower ear and a neat comb-over hiding a childhood scar. Back upstairs in the hotel, detectives inventory room 1046. And what's missing says more than what's left. There's no clothes, no shoes, no hat, wallet, razor, no coat, nothing a traveler would own. The only thing they could really find was on the writing table there was a torn necktie label, Otney Worsted Mills, a hairpin, a safety pin, an unlit cigarette, 2 water glasses, one chipped, and a small unused bottle of diluted sulfuric acid. And then on the glass top of the phone stand, there were 4 fingerprints, possibly a woman's, but not much to go on. By afternoon, the Kansas City papers pushed out the news, and quickly calls come flooding in. One woman calls the presidential hotel asking what Roland T. Owen looks like, and she swears that he's from Clinton, Missouri. Police also learned that Owen may have been seen on 12th Street with 2 unidentified women. Somewhere between rumor and truth, a shape flickers, a man and his companion, a woman in a dark coat with a fur collar. And then there's the sightings from the night before. Robert Lane, a city worker, says that a young man in only an undershirt and trousers flagged him down near 13th and Lydia. He climbed into his car holding one arm like he was catching blood, and the man said to himself, "I'll kill that tomorrow," just before he hopped out at a taxi stand. After the death hits the news, Lane views the body and swears it's the same guy. The detectives aren't quite convinced, but the scratch on the arm is there. and police wire Los Angeles to check for Roland T. Owen, but there's no record of a man by that name. And they follow a thread to the nearby Muhlenbach Hotel. Lookalike stayed there the night before New Year's under a different alias, Eugene K. Scott, again giving Los Angeles as the location that he comes from, and he demanded an interior room. But there were no records of Eugene K. Scott in LA either. And days pass and the body remains unclaimed. March is coming and time is running out. If no one claims his body, the city will bury him anonymously in a pauper's grave. And then another phone call comes in. A calm voice asks the funeral home to delay the burial, promising to send money to give the man a proper funeral, quote, near his sister. When the director warns he'll notify police, the caller says he doesn't mind. A few days later, an envelope arrives with cash wrapped in newspaper, just enough for a service. A florist gets a call for the order of 13 American Beauty roses and a card, and receives 2 more envelopes with 5s. The unsigned card reads, Love Forever, Louise. The calls trace back to payphones. No one sees who sends the money. Detectives attend the burial themselves, some posing as gravediggers, waiting for mourners who never came. Days later, a woman calls the newsroom to correct a story that he was buried in a pauper grave. He had a proper funeral, she says. When they ask who she was, she just answered, Never mind. I know what I'm talking about. He got into a jam. Then she hangs up. For more than a year, the dead man is everyone and no one. Missing nephew, brother, friend. And at one point they thought that he may have been a wrestler named Cecil Werner, but all ended up dead ends. Then in the fall of 1936, an Alabama woman sees a picture in the Sunday paper. Ruby Ogletree calls Kansas City right away. The man in room 1046 was her son, Artemis. He left Birmingham at 17 years old to hitchhike west in 1934, and he kept riding home. Only now Ruby adds something that makes the cemetery roses feel colder. She received letters from Artemis in 1935, after he was already dead. The first was typewritten, which she found surprising because her son didn't know how to type, and it was written with slang that didn't sound like him. Later letters sent from New York said that he was going to Europe. Later, she had gotten a call from Memphis from a man calling himself Godfrey Jordan. He said that Artemis had saved him from thugs in Cairo, married wealthy women there, lost a thumb and couldn't write, but that he was alive and well. Ruby talked to him for 45 minutes. He seemed to know things that only Artemis would know, but nothing about it felt right. Ruby later suspected that the caller wasn't Godfrey Jordan at all, but Joe Simpson, a friend Artemis had traveled with. And she chased him for years trying to confront him, but he was pretty good at avoiding her. And when she finally cornered him in December of 1939, he promised to meet her to deliver a badly typed letter that he had gotten from her son to prove that he wasn't involved in anything. But he never showed up and the trail cooled. The case froze. Police did find one more breadcrumb. Before the hotel president, Artemis had shared a room with another man at the St. Regis Hotel in Kansas City. They never proved that the roommate was Don, but the shadow of a companion moves beside Artemis in the weeks before his death. And then a near miss that still haunts. In 1937, New York police arrested a man named Joseph Martin for a trunk murder. One of his aliases is Donald Kelso. Handwriting samples are compared to the written address and corrections on the bizarre typed letters sent to Ruby. Interest spikes, but no charges were ever filed in Artemis's murder. The thin line to Don really kind of just leads nowhere. So what happened inside 1046? The timeline is cruel. The drying blood told Dr. Flanders that the injuries were likely 6 to 7 hours old by late morning, meaning that the beating and stabbing hit before dawn. Yet, at 7 a.m., a voice still managed, "Come in, turn on the light," while the hall chain was engaged from the inside, which seems impossible, but a dying man can set a chain. Pain can lend at least stubborn strength, and perhaps shock told him his injuries weren't fatal, that he needed to lock the door so whoever did this didn't return. But even if that's true, it still leaves sort of a chess problem in brass and shadow, because whoever did this had time to wipe the room as far as like gather the man's life into a pocket. They got all of his things and they vanished down a stairwell or into that inner court of windows before the red light on the switchboard glowed again. Newspapers printed the nobody lying like a ghost's riddle, the victim denying there had been anyone there with him, but a medical affidavit made after the autopsy never noted a clear speech. Later viewers would say that the reporting might have stitched scenes together, mixing bathroom and bedside, timing and statements, and even the earliest accounts sometimes contradict the order of discovery. That's the curse of old rooms. The story has fingerprints all over it, and none of them say the same thing. Still, a few hard pieces remain on the board. A typed letter from Artemis when Artemis couldn't type. Phone calls from payphones, one buying roses signed Love Forever Louise. A man named Don who might be a lover, a boss, a title, or nobody at all. Two women seen with Artemis on 12th Street. A roommate at St. Regis, a door chained from the inside, and a mother who knew her son by the shape of a scar beneath his hair. Somewhere out there, maybe in a shoebox in an attic, the last puzzle piece lives. In the early 2000s, a librarian in Kansas City took a call. An estate cleanout had turned up a box of clippings about the case, and one item mentioned in the newspaper stories. The caller refused to say what. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was the kind of nothing that makes everything make sense. The line went dead, the box disappeared back into the ordinary life, and now the trail still lies cold to this day. That's it for today's episode of Legends May Live. If you enjoyed the story, please remember to like, subscribe, and share it with a friend. Until next time, if you ever find an old box of clippings and something that doesn't belong, call someone. Sometimes history doesn't haunt rooms. It waits in closets.